My roommate returned from her vacation. The lock turned, and I heard, "I'm home finally." Then my dog started growling, and my neighbor texted, "That's not her. Get out immediately." The voice came through the apartment door at 7:23 p.m. on a Friday evening, cheerful and familiar, exactly how my roommate Allison always sounded when she got home from trips. I'd been sitting on the couch watching Netflix with my German Shepherd Max, sprawled across my lap, in the way 70-pound dogs do when they've decided you're furniture. The sound of the key in the lock was expected. Allison had been in Hawaii for 10 days visiting her sister, and she'd texted me that morning saying her flight was landing at SeaTac around 6 p.m. The timing was right, the voice sounded right, and I'd started to shift Max off my legs so I could get up and help with luggage. Then Max went rigid. Not the alert posture he took when he heard someone in the hallway, but something I'd only seen once before when a guy high on meth had tried to force his way into our building. A low, continuous growl emanated from deep in his chest, his lips pulling back to show teeth, every muscle in his body tense and focused on the door. At exactly that moment, my phone buzzed with a text from Mrs. Eleanor Cho, our neighbor from 3B who'd lived in the building for 15 years and who'd become friendly with Allison over shared morning coffee runs. The message was 3 words in all caps. "That's not her." I'd been living in Seattle for 3 years, working as a freelance graphic designer from our 2-bedroom apartment in Capitol Hill. Allison Brenner had been my roommate for 18 months, a situation that had started as a Craigslist arrangement and evolved into genuine friendship. She was a pharmaceutical sales rep who traveled frequently for work, organized and reliable, the kind of roommate who always paid rent on time and left notes when she borrowed your milk. We'd fallen into an easy cohabitation, respecting each other's space while occasionally watching movies together or splitting takeout. Max had been my dog for 4 years, adopted from a shelter after my previous relationship ended, and I'd needed something stable and loving in my life. German Shepherds are known for their intelligence and protective instincts, and Max had both in abundance. He'd never shown aggression toward Allison, had actually loved her, greeting her enthusiastically every time she came home. The growl he was producing now was the sound of a dog confronting a threat he absolutely did not trust. The door was opening, the deadbolt already turned, and I had maybe 3 seconds to decide whether to trust my dog and my neighbor or feel foolish for overreacting to what was probably nothing. Mrs. Cho's text sat on my screen, impossible to ignore, her certainty cutting through my rational mind's attempts to dismiss the situation. The woman who stepped through our doorway looked exactly like Allison. Same height, same build, same shoulder-length blonde hair, same style of casual travel clothes Allison always wore. She was pulling a suitcase, the kind of wheeled carry-on Allison owned, and her face broke into a smile when she saw me on the couch. "Hey, I'm exhausted." That flight was brutal. She started to close the door behind her, and Max's growl intensified into something that sounded like it came from a wolf rather than a domestic animal. The woman's eyes flicked to Max, and her smile faltered for just a fraction of a second. "What's wrong with him? Is he okay?" The question should have been natural, concern for a pet she'd known for over a year. But something in the delivery was off, the tone slightly wrong, like an actor reading a line rather than a person genuinely worried. I stood up, keeping myself between Max and the woman, my phone still in my hand with Mrs. Cho's text visible. I asked her a question that seemed innocuous, but which I knew would reveal everything. "How was your sister's new place in Maui?" The woman's face brightened immediately, and she launched into a description of a beachfront condo with an incredible view, talking about swimming and snorkeling and Mai Tais at sunset. It was all plausible and exactly what you'd expect from a Hawaiian vacation. Except Allison's sister lived in Oahu, not Maui, and her apartment was nowhere near a beach. I'd helped Allison pack for the trip, had heard her complain about her sister's cramped studio in downtown Honolulu and the lack of tourist attractions in that particular neighborhood. This woman had just failed a test she didn't know she was taking, and the confirmation of Mrs. Cho's warning made my pulse spike with adrenaline. I told her I needed to take Max out for a walk, that he was clearly agitated and needed exercise. The woman looked uncertain, but nodded, saying she was going to take a shower and unpack. I grabbed Max's leash with shaking hands and headed for the door, the woman stepping aside to let us pass. The hallway felt like the longest walk of my life, Max pressed against my leg and still emanating that low growl. Mrs. Cho's door opened before I could knock, and she pulled me inside her apartment with surprising strength for a 72-year-old woman. She was a retired librarian, sharp-minded and observant, someone who noticed details others missed. Her apartment smelled like jasmine tea and old books, familiar and comforting. She closed the door and immediately started talking, her voice low and urgent. "That woman is not Allison. I saw her get out of a lift 10 minutes ago, and I was about to say hello when I realized her face was wrong. The features are right, but the expression is wrong. The way she moves is wrong. I've had coffee with Allison twice a week for over a year. I know how she walks, how she holds herself. That woman is a stranger." I asked Mrs. Cho if she was absolutely certain, knowing even as I asked that she wouldn't have texted me with such urgency if she'd had any doubts. She nodded emphatically, pulling out her phone to show me a photo she'd taken from her peephole, zoomed in on the woman's face. "Look at this." She pulled up another photo, this one of Allison from a building event 6 months ago. Compare them. The photos were similar but not identical. The woman in the hallway had Allison's general features, But Mrs. Cho was right about the expression being different. The eyes weren't quite the same shape. The smile didn't reach them in the same way. It was like looking at a really good cosplay or a sibling rather than the actual person. My hands started shaking as the implications hit me. Someone who looked like Allison had just entered my apartment with Allison's key, knew enough about her life to fake a conversation about her trip, and was now inside our home with access to everything we owned. Where was the real Allison? I pulled out my phone and called her number, the one I'd texted with that morning about her flight arrival. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail, Allison's familiar voice telling me to leave a message. I tried again. Voicemail. A 3rd time. Voicemail. Mrs. Cho was already calling 911, her voice calm and clear as she explained the situation to the dispatcher. Someone has entered my neighbor's apartment impersonating his roommate. We need police here immediately. The address is 1847 Broadway East, apartment 3A. Yes, I'm certain. I've known the real tenant for over a year. The police arrived 12 minutes later, 2 patrol officers who took statements from Mrs. Cho and me in her apartment. Officer Kevin Yates was a 20-year veteran who'd probably seen every weird situation Seattle had to offer, and Officer Nina Torres was younger but equally professional. They listened to our story with expressions that suggested they were trying to determine if this was a genuine emergency or a neighbor dispute blown out of proportion. Officer Yates asked if I had any proof that the woman in my apartment wasn't my roommate, and I showed him the text exchange with Allison from that morning, then explained about the Maui versus Oahu discrepancy and Max's unprecedented reaction. Mrs. Cho provided her photos and her certainty based on 18 months of regular interaction. Officer Torres asked if we'd had any contact with the real Allison since this woman arrived, and I explained about the calls going to voicemail. She suggested we try calling from a different number, in case Allison was screening calls from my phone specifically. Mrs. Cho offered her phone, and I dialed Allison's number from it. 2 rings, then Allison answered, her voice sounding strained and frightened. Hello? Who is this? If you are enjoying this story already, please subscribe to see more stories like this. I identified myself quickly, asking where she was and if she was okay. The pause before she answered felt eternal. I'm still in Hawaii. My flight was canceled because of mechanical issues, and I'm rebooked for tomorrow morning. Why? What's wrong? The relief at hearing her voice was immediately overwhelmed by the confirmation that someone else was in our apartment pretending to be her. I told her as calmly as I could that someone who looked like her had entered our apartment with a key and was currently inside claiming to be her. Allison's sharp intake of breath was audible even over the phone. That's not possible. How would anyone get my key? And who would even know what I look like well enough to impersonate me? Those were excellent questions, and Officer Yates immediately requested to speak with her. He verified her identity through a series of questions about her address, driver's license number, and recent travel, then explained that they'd be entering the apartment to investigate. He asked Allison to stay on the line with dispatch while this happened, establishing a record of the real tenant's location and cooperation. The officers approached our apartment door with hands near their weapons, clearly taking the situation seriously now that they'd confirmed the actual tenant was in Hawaii. Officer Torres knocked firmly and announced police presence. The door opened after a moment, and the woman who looked like Allison appeared, her expression shifting from surprise to confusion. Officers? Is something wrong? Her performance was excellent, the concerned citizen confused by police at her door. Officer Yates asked her for identification, and she produced a driver's license from her purse. The license showed Allison's name, address, and a photo that matched both the woman standing in front of us and the real Allison closely enough to pass casual inspection. But when Officer Torres asked her to confirm her date of birth, she hesitated for just a second before answering. The date she gave was correct, but that hesitation had been telling. Officer Yates asked her about her recent trip to Hawaii, and she launched into the same story about Maui and the beachfront condo. When he asked specifically which island her sister lived on, she said Maui confidently. Incorrect. He told her the real Allison was on the phone with dispatch and was currently in Oahu. The woman's face went through a rapid series of expressions before settling on defiance. She tried to run. Officer Torres caught her before she made it 3 steps, taking her down with practiced efficiency and cuffing her while reading Miranda rights. The woman was screaming that this was a mistake, that she was Allison Brenner and could prove it, that we were all making a terrible error. But when Officer Yates asked her to empty her pockets, she had a second wallet with a different ID showing the name Rebecca Valdez, 32 years old, from Portland. The apartment was searched with Allison's permission given over the phone, and what the officers found was chilling. A backpack hidden in the coat closet containing latex gloves, a mini laptop, a portable document scanner, and a list of passwords and account information. Someone had been planning to steal Allison's identity, and Rebecca had been the operative sent to physically access our apartment and gather whatever information the preparatory surveillance hadn't captured. Officer Yates called for backup and a detective, this having escalated from a weird impersonation incident to clear evidence of identity theft and potentially more serious crimes. Detective Leonard Briggs arrived within 30 minutes, a 15-year veteran of Seattle PD's Fraud and Identity Theft Division. He was methodical and thorough, photographing everything in the backpack and asking detailed questions about Allison's recent activities and whether we'd noticed anything unusual in the weeks before her trip. I tried to remember if there had been any warning signs, any indication that Allison was being targeted. The only thing that stood out was a weird conversation she'd mentioned having with someone claiming to be from her credit card company about 3 weeks ago, asking to verify recent transactions. She'd thought it was legitimate fraud prevention, but now it seemed like it might have been social engineering to gather information. Detective Briggs nodded grimly when I mentioned this, explaining that sophisticated identity theft rings often used phone calls and phishing to build detailed profiles before attempting physical access. Rebecca Valdez was being processed downtown, and he expected she'd either lawyer up immediately or potentially cooperate in exchange for a deal, depending on how deep her involvement was. The forensic analysis of Rebecca's mini laptop revealed connections to a larger criminal organization. A digital forensics specialist named Gordon Wu, with 12 years in cybercrime investigation, extracted data showing Rebecca was part of a network that had targeted hundreds of people across the Pacific Northwest. The operation worked by identifying people with good credit and stable employment, conducting surveillance to learn their routines, and then exploiting travel or other absences to gain physical access to homes and steal identity documents. In some cases, they'd even installed keyloggers and spyware to capture passwords and financial information. Allison had been targeted because her travel schedule made her predictable. Her social media presence provided abundant information about her life and habits, and her pharmaceutical sales job meant she likely had access to good benefits and credit. The fact that she had a male roommate had probably been seen as a complication, but not a deal-breaker. Hence Rebecca's plan to arrive when I'd be home and play the role convincingly enough to avoid immediate suspicion. What we didn't know initially was how Rebecca had obtained Allison's key and how she'd managed to look so much like her. The key question was answered when Detective Briggs found evidence that Allison's car had been broken into 2 months earlier in a parking garage. She'd reported the incident, noting that nothing seemed to be missing, but the thieves had apparently made copies of her house keys before replacing them. The resemblance issue was more complex. Rebecca naturally looked somewhat similar to Allison, but she'd undergone temporary cosmetic modifications to enhance the similarity. Colored contacts to match Allison's eye color, a wig that matched Allison's hairstyle, and subtle makeup contouring to mimic facial features. Combined with the fact that I'd been expecting Allison home and would therefore be predisposed to see her, the impersonation had almost worked. If Max hadn't reacted and Mrs. Cho hadn't been vigilant, Rebecca might have spent hours in our apartment copying documents and installing spyware before leaving, with me none the wiser until fraudulent charges started appearing. Allison flew back to Seattle the next day, her vacation ruined by the knowledge that criminals had been targeting her. She stayed with her sister in Oahu for an extra 2 days while our apartment was processed as a crime scene and then thoroughly cleaned, neither of us comfortable with the idea of her coming back to a space that had been violated so completely. When she finally did return, she brought her sister Natalie with her, both of them visibly shaken by the experience. Allison hugged Max for a solid 5 minutes, thanking him repeatedly for being such a good boy, and she brought Mrs. Cho flowers and a heartfelt thank you note for her vigilance. We sat around the living room that first night and tried to process what had happened, Allison reviewing the security footage from the building that showed Rebecca entering with her key and looking completely confident about belonging there. The casual nature of the crime, the calculation behind it, made all of us feel unsafe in ways that would take time to overcome. The investigation expanded as Rebecca's cooperation led to the arrest of 12 other people involved in the identity theft ring. The leader was a man named Douglas Thornberry, 45 years old with a sophisticated background in technology and fraud. Douglas had been running the operation for over 4 years, recruiting operatives like Rebecca to conduct the physical components while he managed the digital infrastructure and fencing of stolen information. The ring had generated over $8 million through various schemes, selling complete identity packages on the dark web and executing financial fraud using victims' information. Rebecca had been involved for 18 months, and while she'd cooperated by providing names and evidence, she still faced serious charges including identity theft, burglary, and conspiracy. Her attorney, a public defender named Olivia Grantham, had negotiated a plea deal in exchange for her testimony against Douglas and the others, but she was still looking at a minimum of 5 years in federal prison. The federal charges came through the U.S. Attorney's Office, prosecuted by Assistant U.S. Attorney Jerome Keller, who specialized in cybercrime and organized fraud. Jerome had been building cases against identity theft rings for over a decade and was thrilled to finally have solid evidence and cooperative witnesses against Douglas's operation. The trial took place 9 months after Rebecca's arrest, a 3-week proceeding in federal court, where Allison and I both testified about the impersonation incident and the evidence found in our apartment. Sitting in that courtroom and describing how I'd almost let a stranger into Allison's private space, how close we'd come to a much worse outcome, was surreal and disturbing. Douglas's defense attorney tried to argue that the evidence had been obtained improperly and that Rebecca's testimony was unreliable because she'd been offered a deal. But the digital evidence from Gordon Wu's forensic analysis was incontrovertible, showing Douglas's direct involvement in planning and profiting from hundreds of identity thefts. The jury convicted Douglas on all counts after deliberating for just under 6 hours. He was sentenced to 32 years in federal prison, a harsh penalty that Judge Marianne Caldwell justified by noting the scope of the conspiracy and the number of victims whose lives had been damaged by his criminal enterprise. Rebecca received her negotiated sentence of 8 years, reduced from the potential 25 she'd faced if she hadn't cooperated. The other 11 defendants received sentences ranging from 3 to 15 years, depending on their roles and willingness to cooperate. Judge Caldwell's statement during Douglas's sentencing addressed the broader implications of identity theft, noting that these crimes destroyed victims' financial security and sense of safety in ways that took years to recover from. She specifically mentioned Allison's case as an example of how close the scheme had come to succeeding and the importance of vigilant neighbors and alert pets in preventing crime. The aftermath for Allison was complicated and long-lasting. She'd spent months dealing with credit monitoring services, police reports, and the psychological impact of knowing criminals had been studying her life with predatory intent. She'd changed all her passwords, installed additional security measures in the apartment, and become hypervigilant about her personal information in ways that were probably healthy, but also exhausting. She'd started seeing a therapist, Dr. Rachel Flores, who specialized in trauma from crime victimization, to process the violation of her privacy and the knowledge that she'd been targeted. Dr. Flores had explained that identity theft wasn't just a financial crime, but a personal one, an invasion that made people feel unsafe in their own lives. Allison had nightmares about the imposter, dreams where Rebecca's face morphed into her own until she couldn't tell which was which. The psychological impact was significant and ongoing. For me, the experience had changed how I thought about security and trust. I'd always been relatively casual about things like keys and passwords, assuming that basic precautions were sufficient. Now I understood that sophisticated criminals could exploit even careful people through a combination of technical skill and social engineering. I'd upgraded every aspect of our apartment's security, installing smart locks that logged entries, security cameras inside and out, and a monitoring system that alerted my phone to any unusual activity. I'd also developed a new appreciation for Max's instincts, trusting his judgment about people in ways I hadn't before. The dog, who'd seemed like emotional support, had proven to be literal protection, his ability to detect something wrong with Rebecca being the first and most important warning we'd received. I'd increased his training with a professional handler who specialized in protection work, honing his natural instincts into even more reliable capabilities. Mrs. Cho became something of a local hero, her story featured in neighborhood watch newsletters and security awareness campaigns. She'd been interviewed by local news outlets about the importance of knowing your neighbors and trusting your observations, even when they seemed implausible. Her photo recognition, her willingness to send that urgent text message, had been the second critical warning that had prevented disaster. She downplayed her role, saying anyone would have done the same, but we all knew that wasn't true. Most people would have doubted themselves, would have assumed they were mistaken rather than trust their instincts. Mrs. Cho's confidence in her own observations, built from years of paying attention to details, had been essential. Allison and I made sure she knew how grateful we were, helping her with groceries and maintenance tasks, and generally being the kind of neighbors she'd proven herself to be to us. The apartment felt different after everything that had happened. Despite the new security measures and the knowledge that the criminals were in prison, there was a loss of innocence about our living space. It had been violated by someone who'd studied it specifically to exploit it, and that knowledge created a low-level anxiety that took months to fade. Allison considered moving but decided against it, not wanting to let the criminals win by forcing her out of a home she'd built. Instead, we renovated, changing things enough that the space felt new and different, reclaiming it from the memory of Rebecca's presence. We repainted the living room, replaced furniture, installed better lighting. Small changes that created psychological distance from the traumatic event while maintaining the practical advantages of our location and lease. The identity theft ring's victims numbered in the hundreds once Douglas's full operation was mapped out. Many of them had suffered financial losses before realizing they'd been compromised, with destroyed credit ratings and years of work to restore their identities. Allison and I had been lucky in that regard. The impersonation stopped before any actual financial fraud could occur. But we'd both joined a support group for identity theft victims organized by the U.S. Attorney's Office and a local victim advocacy organization. Hearing other people's stories about the long-term damage these crimes caused was sobering and educational. We learned about people who'd lost job opportunities because of credit issues they didn't cause, who'd been arrested for crimes committed using their stolen identities, who'd spent years fighting to prove they were who they said they were. The scope of harm was staggering, and it reinforced how close we'd come to joining those statistics. 2 years after the incident, I ran into Rebecca Valdez at a victim impact panel I'd volunteered to speak at. She was participating as part of her sentence requirements, attending to hear from victims about the consequences of crimes like hers. We made eye contact across the room, and I watched her face register recognition and what might have been shame. After the panel, she approached me, her voice quiet, as she apologized for what she'd done. She'd explained that she'd been recruited by Douglas when she was in a desperate financial situation, convinced that identity theft was a victimless crime because insurance covered the losses. Working with victims through the panel had shown her how wrong that assumption was, how much psychological damage accompanied the financial harm. She'd understood theoretically that what she'd done was wrong, but seeing actual victims describe their experiences had made it real in ways prison time hadn't. I'd accepted her apology politely, though I wasn't sure I believed her transformation was complete or permanent. People who'd caused harm often claimed rehabilitation when facing consequences, and I'd become more skeptical of such claims. If this story keeps your interest, Please subscribe to get more stories like this. The experience had changed my career trajectory in unexpected ways. I'd been doing generic graphic design work, corporate logos, and website layouts before the incident. Afterward, I'd become interested in security and privacy visualization, using my design skills to help companies communicate complex security concepts to users. I'd taken courses in cybersecurity fundamentals and had started specializing in designing interfaces and educational materials that helped people protect themselves from identity theft and digital fraud. The work was more meaningful than what I'd been doing before, directly connected to preventing others from experiencing what Allison and I had endured. I'd consulted on awareness campaigns for police departments and victim advocacy groups, creating materials that explained how to recognize social engineering and protect personal information. The niche had proven lucrative and satisfying, giving me purpose beyond just earning a living. Allison had eventually moved out of our shared apartment, not because of lingering trauma, but because she'd gotten engaged to someone she'd met through her sister. The relationship had developed in the aftermath of the identity theft incident, Natalie having introduced Allison to a friend who'd provided emotional support during the investigation and trial. They'd gotten married in a small ceremony in Hawaii, and Allison had relocated to San Francisco for her husband's job. We'd stayed in touch, maintaining the friendship that had been forged through shared crisis, and she'd told me multiple times that she'd never forget the moment Max had growled and Mrs. Cho had texted. Those two warnings had saved her from financial ruin and possibly worse, given that some of Douglas's victims had experienced stalking and harassment beyond just theft. The timing had been perfect, the convergence of animal instinct and human observation creating a warning system that technology alone wouldn't have provided. I'd adopted a second dog after Allison moved out, a Belgian Malinois named Luna from the same trainer who'd worked with Max. Having two protective dogs felt appropriate given my new awareness of potential threats, and they provided companionship while also making me feel genuinely safe in the apartment. Mrs. Cho approved enthusiastically, often dog-sitting when I traveled for work, and claiming that having the dogs in the building made everyone safer. She'd become family to me in the way neighbors sometimes do when you've been through something intense together, the relationship deepening beyond casual hallway greetings into genuine mutual care. We had coffee every Sunday morning, a tradition that had started after the incident and had continued because both of us valued it. The story of Rebecca's attempted impersonation became something of an urban legend in our neighborhood, the tale of the fake roommate told with growing embellishments at community meetings and safety workshops. The core truth remained powerful even without exaggeration. A sophisticated criminal had come within minutes of successfully infiltrating someone's home, stopped only by an observant neighbor and a protective dog. The elements were simple, but the implications profound. How many other impersonations had succeeded because no one noticed the subtle differences? How many victims had let criminals into their homes and lives because they'd expected someone they trusted and had been given a convincing substitute? The questions haunted security professionals and ordinary people alike, driving increased attention to verification and authentication even in personal relationships. 3 years after the incident, Douglas Thornberry's appeals were exhausted, and his sentence was finalized. His operation had been completely dismantled, with no evidence of the network reconstituting under different leadership. The FBI had used the evidence from Douglas's operation to improve their understanding of identity theft rings and had developed new techniques for detecting and disrupting such organizations before they could cause extensive harm. The case had become a teaching tool, cited in training materials and academic papers about organized cybercrime. Allison and I had been contacted by researchers wanting to understand the victim's perspective, how the crime had affected us, and what protections had proven effective. We'd participated in several studies, hoping our experience could contribute to better prevention strategies. The apartment at 1847 Broadway East eventually became too expensive as Seattle's rental market inflated, and I'd moved to a different neighborhood with better space for 2 large dogs. The new place had better security features and a community that knew about the previous incident and took safety seriously. But I'd sometimes drive past the old building, looking up at the 3rd floor where the door had opened, and someone who wasn't Allison had stepped through. That moment had changed everything, had taught me about the sophistication of modern crime and the importance of vigilance. The voice that had said "I'm home" finally had belonged to a stranger who'd studied and mimicked someone I knew well enough to almost fool me. Almost. The dog had growled, the neighbor had texted, and the imposter had failed. That failure had saved Allison's financial future and possibly her physical safety, had exposed a criminal network, and had taught me lessons I'd carried forward into new awareness and new work. The lock had turned, but we'd turned it back, refusing to let criminals steal what wasn't theirs. That resistance, that refusal, had been justice enough. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.